أن يهلك عدوكم ويستخلفكم في الأرض فينظر كيف تعملون.
The stark fact is that we remain threatened.
The 10th anniversary of 9/11 terror attacks on America was marked last week by solemn bells at Manhattan's Ground Zero, by victorious chanting on a purported al-Qaeda video, and by Director of National Intelligence Jim Clapper's warning of more to come. Indeed, the anniversary was shadowed by extensive security efforts that followed yet another credible but apparently groundless car bomb threat against Washington or New York.
Looking back, the family of a passenger who died in skyjacked United Airlines Flight 175 filed a wrongful death suit against the airline and a security company whose screeners in Boston that fateful morning included some who did not know English or anything about Osama bin Laden or al-Qaeda. Looking ahead, the senior American general for Africa warned of new dangers there from 3 violent extremist organizations seeking an alliance for attacks on U.S. and Western interests. They are the Shabab in Somalia, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb across the Sahel region of northern Africa, and Boko Haram in northern Nigeria.
With more thoughts on the next phase of the war with Islamist extremism, for your ears only, we're joined again by Dr. Walid Phares, a consultant on terrorism to legislators here and abroad. His latest book is The Confrontation, Winning the War Against Future Jihad. Welcome back to our program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's start with Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda hatched the plan for 9/11 and still a war zone. You say America's counterstrike there was correct, but call the follow-up, both military and civilian, inadequate to create real stability. What could have been done better at the start?
Well, bringing down the Taliban and al-Qaeda was a strategic victory, no doubt about that. It was endorsed by the international community and welcomed by a majority of Afghan people across all ethnic groups, including Pashtuns. And mounting campaigns inside Afghanistan to repel the Taliban terror attacks was also a logical option to keep them at bay. But maintaining that Taliban free space was only to allow Afghan civil society, and particularly emerging youth, women, minorities, to perform what I call the socio-political change needed to transform the country's political culture and gradually, into democracy. Instead, the U.S. rushed to what I call a mega construction mode, spending billions on roads, bridges, instead of funding civil society forces to grow and expand. For example, teachers, women's organizations, social network, labor union, new political parties. That's why I believe the U.S. was and still is badly advised on how to enable a civil society to rise with less funding. Instead, we paid 10 times more on hardware in a corrupted environment instead of targeting, precise funding of dynamic social forces for a decade.
Now you say we're doing the unthinkable by dealing with the Taliban, but what's the alternative with no purely military solution in sight?
Of course, it's the unthinkable. It means that we failed, and we will be surrendering Afghanistan to the jihadists at the expense of women, youth, secular minorities, democracy forces, etc. The Taliban are the Taliban, unless they reform from jihadism to political Islamism and disarm. If that happens, it means that we would have been successful in Afghanistan. The notion of either we defeat them militarily or we surrender the country to them, in my sense, is incorrect. Because it's either we use the military force to provide free space for Afghan society to grow and in turn defeat the Taliban ideologically, or we fail in doing so and the Taliban win. So we used the military to keep the Taliban at bay for 10 years, but we failed in empowering the society to win its own war of ideas and isolate the Taliban by ending or limiting their recruitment. So our strategic failure was to ignore the ideological battlefield. It was not in the military realm.
The drawdown is much further along in Iraq, but you see hostile Sunni and Shia forces gaining more influence over moderates.
I think that the strategic challenge in Iraq wasn't and isn't about number of troops, for example, on the ground. It's really about strategic direction for Iraq's future national security. As in Afghanistan, we crumbled a regime, Saddam, but we didn't follow up with the next strategic steps, that is, in the case of Iraq, to put pressures on Iran's regime and deter it from intervening in Iraq. It's all interconnected. Iraq is not an island, and if we do not contain Iran's regime, they will penetrate Iraq, and they are. We don't need 100,000 troops in Iraq. What we actually need to do is establishing a coalition in Iraq of anti-jihadists, such as Kurds, Sunni secular, Shia moderates, and other minorities, including Christians, Turkmen. Such a coalition has a majority in Iraq and would have undergone a deep political change. Instead, we left the Shia to Iran and the Sunni to the Salafists. So if we had a counter-jihadi government, we wouldn't need massive presence to counter the Iranians and the jihadists, because Iraq has impressive sources.
Interestingly, we read that one leader of the new Iraq we helped create has been pressing Iran for release of those imprisoned U.S. hikers. But other than that, you are hugely critical of U.S. efforts to block Tehran's nuclear and missile development and political infiltration in the region to support the democratic uprising that was ultimately battered down by the mullahs. Some say more forceful intervention by Washington would have tainted the protesters or rallied them to the regime.
You know, that argument, the argument that says that our political support to the people of Iran would have tainted the protesters or rallied them, to the regime is precisely a regime argument. It's used by its own propagandists. For example, the Iranian Green Revolution, the 1.5 million people on the streets of Tehran in June of 2009, precisely asked the world and the U.S. via Facebook, YouTube, and other social media to openly condemn the regime and support the demonstrators. If civil society asks us to help them politically and morally, do we worry about the propaganda of the regime? The regime suppressed them regardless of the outside world, not because of the outside world. So in my sense, the revolution was crushed because we ignored it, not because we recognized it. And to conclude on this point, the Arab Spring proved without any doubt that civil societies have called openly in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Libya on us and on the world to utter those words of support. And we did, and they won. In Syria today, for example, every demonstration is telling us to extend our support. So what happened to the argument of the kiss of death? And in fact, our silence has been the kiss of death.
Overall, you say the secret weapon Washington needs to develop is ideological to counter the appeal of Islamist violence. But isn't that something that only Islamic leaders themselves can do?
Look, the expansion of Al-Qaeda or its defeat is not linked basically to a war of drones. In fact, it is linked to a war of ideas. Yes, the Islamist leaders are needed in this battle, but basically it is something that forces in society will have to do, and we have to support. And these forces are not always the Islamic leaders. We saw a poor student in Tunisia triggering the revolt. Google and Facebook people in Egypt, women and intellectuals across the region. It's not always about secular or Islamist. It's really about being local and authentic in my sense.
Terror expert Walid Phares. His latest book is The Confrontation, Winning the War Against Future Jihad.